Hi, my name is Mickey Richardson, and I was really unsettled about who to do for my report. I thought about doing Nehemiah and I thought about doing Hiram of Tyre, but I think I finally settled on doing Cyrus the Great, as his policies and his actions were pivotal in the history of the Hebrew peoples. Uh, First, I want to discuss or look at his social policies. He was overarchingly a reformer and a progressivist, or what we would call such. He encouraged literacy and culture. And if you think about it, most of our texts that we have from uh, the Old Testament were written either during or shortly after the Babylonian exile. And so we get all of this writing and thought and culture that comes out of Babylon. And he is part of that. He was what we would call a modern day funder for the arts. He encouraged literacy and culture in even the people that he had conquered. And so I think that's one aspect of him that I think is important. Secondly, he was very tolerant of other people's religious culture, including their religious practices. He was not the type that wanted what we would call a melting pot. You know how we say sometimes that America is a melting pot of various cultures, ethnicities, and ideologies. Well, it wasn't exactly that way in ancient Babylon. From what I understand, he allowed the people to retain their individual customs and cultures, and this was a very private thing that they did, and something that I think where we get the idea that the Hebrew people are very exclusive. And I think it comes out of this because they were able to retain so much of their exclusivity while they were in captivity. The last thing is that he was kind of a government reformer. He established a system of government, and I think we are all familiar with the setting up of the satraps and administrative advances that he made in order to govern a large body of large geographic area. So this was a major empire, and he was able to solidify it peacefully for a period of time using governmental administrative means. Uh, Next thing that I want to look at was how he used or dealt with his relationship, I guess, with the Jews and their God. And I want to look at first the royal decree to which he gave that returned the Jews to their homeland. The Jews had been taken, or the first deportation of Jews, Israelites, had taken place during 597 BC, and they started to return, or he gave his edict in 538. So that's almost 60 years, if I do my math right, that they had been absent. So at least one generation, if not more, between the time that they had left and the time that they returned. So you wonder, at this point, I think, what would make them go back? They had a really kind of from what we can understand, they had a pretty good life. Uh, they were able to reach high places in government. They were able to retain their own religion, their own practices. They weren't really treated harshly at that time as a captured people. So many captured people were becoming slaves and were tortured and were brutalized, and they were allowed to exist, at least in a semi-peaceful and semi-autonomous condition. So you kind of wonder, what were the motivations for them to return to the land that had been their forefathers and to reestablish the Hebrew nation. But as it was, that did happen, and in 538 there was a royal decree given by Cyrus, and it's recorded in Ezra 1 through 8. And he says that God told him to rebuild the temple at Jerusalem. Of course, I'm paraphrasing. He also says that any one of them who wanted to go back and resettle should do it. And so that means that not everybody went back, just those who chose to. I often wonder what happened to the ones that stayed behind. Secondly, what were these people returning to? From some accounts that I have read, when they got back, they found the land in a very drought-like situation. And they found it inhabited by people who were not Hebrew or Jewish, Israelite, as they define the term Israelite. And I say that exclusively because the definition of being an Israelite had mutated while they were in captivity. And we see that when they bring the Book of the Law out, as an example, somehow foreigners are run out of town, run out of Dodge. Even people who are married to foreigners and have their children with foreigners are told to get rid of their kids that are foreigners. Well, this is in no way correlates with Mosaic law that says, you know, remember you were once a foreigner in Egypt and remember how you were treated. So you need to treat the foreigners with as equal respect or kindly. But this is a new Israelite that emerges from Babylon. They no longer exactly do things like they did prior to um, the captivity. Being an Israelite is something exclusive. We get a lot of the discussion about them being the chosen people by God, as opposed to them being one of many nations. So anyway, I wonder oftentimes why they wanted to come back. I often think, as I thought about this, well, perhaps it was because they needed a military buffer. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into the military history of it, but perhaps that, you know, this was kind of a place that they refer to as beyond the river. That's a phrase that comes up in Ezra a couple of times, and so I often wonder if wasn't a need for a militaristic outpost, or perhaps it was simply just a nostalgia for some kind of a homeland, as we sometimes are accustomed to having. Um, the other thing was Cyrus uses the word, or uses the Hebrew God as the reason why he is allowing the Israelites to return to their homeland. But Cyrus didn't worship the Hebrew God. He worshipped Ishtar and Marduk, pagans, essentially. These were the uh, male and female deities of Babylon at the time. Uh, but yet he appeals, or makes his appeal, to the Hebrew God. I wonder what the reason was for doing this, if it was just a convenience sake. If he, I don't know if that he really was religiously given to one or the other, or if he would have said anything just to kind of keep peace. You know how some people will go against their own beliefs if they feel that it's mutually beneficial or that it increases them to some aspect. So anyway, I kind of wondered that. But in a sense, the truth is that Cyrus was used by God. And it made me kind of stop and think that even non-believers still bow to the will of the divine. We see that today. Cyrus was not a Christian, or not a Christian, of course he wasn't. He was not a believer in the Hebrew God, but yet he was used by the Hebrew God. And then lastly, I want to bring out something from Ezra 6, 3 through 5. Cyrus had also allowed all of the implements that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem to be returned to the new temple when it was beginning to be built. Where had they been in the interim, in the almost 60 years between the time that they were stolen or removed from the temple, the old temple in Jerusalem, until they were reinstated in the new temple in Jerusalem? They had been used in pagan worship. These implements, the gold and silver bowls and the various and sundry things that were used during the worship service and the sacrifices in the temple, had been used in worship in a pagan temple, in the Babylonian temple of Marduk, in fact. So you kind of wonder, seems to be a lot of synergism, I think is the word that I want to use, going on, where maybe Hebrew practices and Babylonian practices were melding. Kind of like how I think what had happened when the Israelites moved into the land of Canaan and the Canaanites just kind of blended together. And what we had was the culmination um, of worship practices, and that those things were eventually what eventually became Hebrew worship was really kind of a melding point. And I think that culture in a lot of ways, the Babylonian culture kind of seeped in a little bit. But I could be wrong about that. I've had some people who say maybe not, but I kind of think that they certainly were influenced by Babylonian culture, and I think, the use of the instruments of worship, the bowls and various things that from the pagan temple to the Jerusalem temple and back, or Jerusalem to pagan to back to being in the Jerusalem temple and nobody really threw a fit about them, coming from the temple of Marduk. And so it wasn't really didn't seem to be a big deal. So anyway, that was something that I had noticed. The last thing that I wanted to bring out, and this was kind of something that I had noticed, was sort of a power shift. When the kingdom was first established under Saul, it was God who went and chose the ruler of the Hebrew people. And he had that ruler anointed. But when they came back from the Babylonian captivity, it was the Hebrew leader who chose to build the house of God. And that kind of switch just kind of struck me. It shows it's indicative of the change in their mind of how they saw their relationship with God. And so I often wonder if that played a part in some of the new styles of worship that they brought about. And I think that's an interesting way to see it. See that their mind, their thinking had changed during the captivity, and I think that was due a great deal in part to the Babylonian influence of government and a king and what have you. So anyway, I hope I haven't confused you too much. I know I felt like I was kind of rambling. But overall, I think that Cyrus is probably one of the most unique people in history. I think his influence and his legacy with the Hebrew people is definitely underrated. I know that he's seen as someone who was very kind to them, who allowed them to return, but I think he did more than that. I think there was a lot of what we know as Hebrew literature was certainly influenced under his reign. And as a matter of fact, I think Jeremiah was probably one of them who lived during or shortly after that time, as well as one of the Isaiahs. And I know in saying that, somebody's probably going to say that there was only one Isaiah, but that's okay. But anyway, thank you for allowing me to do this. I had fun.